Oui, on vous parle à vous. Donc, bonjour Matias. Hi Matias. Je vais parler en français car le créneau est très court et c'est plus fluide dans ma langue natale. Matias interviendra en espagnol ou en français, on n'a pas décidé. Donc nous sommes dans cette table ronde consacrée à Globalisation et sciences ouvertes en français, Globalization and Open Science in English. Nous sommes 6 personnes, c'est beaucoup, 4 sociologues et 2 chercheurs en sciences du design, des chercheurs sur l'open science et des chercheurs en open science. Je crois que cette table ronde, dans sa composition, reflète bien des tensions autour d'un objet de recherche, l'open science, qui est très protéiforme, polysémique, et nous sommes toutes et tous impliqués dans des terrains de recherche à l'international, internationaux, avec des parcours très mondialisés, entre guillemets. Donc, nous faisons le pari qu'on arrive à produire un peu d'intelligibilité avec ce format et que la modération ne soit pas trop contraignante pour vous, les intervenants et intervenantes. Alors, je vais présenter successivement nos collègues. Donc, Matias Milia est un sociologue formé au Science and Technology Studies. Il est d'origine argentine et il a vécu et travaillé en Argentine, en Équateur, au Mexique et en France. Et en utilisant des méthodes numériques et ethnographiques, il étudie actuellement l'enchevêtrement des infrastructures de données, des connaissances environnementales, mais aussi de la science participative et la dynamique d'adoption de l'open science et de l'open access, une technique d'accès à la littérature scientifique. Et dans ce travail, il privilégie une approche plutôt transnationale à la recherche d'implications pratiques et d'utilisation potentielle de ces résultats de recherche. Il va nous en dire un petit peu plus. Je vais aller plus vite sur la présentation de Fernanda Beigel, qui est aussi sociologue et docteur en sciences sociales. Elle mène des études comparatives sur la performance éditoriale et les asymétries de genre, sur les cultures institutionnelles, ainsi que sur l'évaluation de la recherche et de la science ouverte. Elle est chercheuse au CONICET, National Scientific and Technical Research Council en Argentine, et aussi professeure titulaire de l'Université Nationale de Cuyo. Elle a présidé, et elle va nous apporter des choses de ce point de vue-là, le comité consultatif pour la science ouverte à l'UNESCO et préside le comité national argentin pour la science ouverte depuis 2021. Pierre Lévy, qui est à ma droite, est professeur au Conservatoire national des arts et métiers, HDR, titulaire d'une chaire de design, de la chaire de design Jean Prouvé, et chercheur au laboratoire d'ICEN. Il est diplômé en génie mécanique de l'Université technologique de Compiègne, d'un doctorat en sciences du Kansai et d'une HDR en sciences de l'information et de la communication. Et il a passé plus de 20 ans à l'étranger, notamment au Japon, travaillé dans le monde industriel, et est aujourd'hui chercheur en design. Il s'intéresse à la correspondance entre des théories et des pratiques du design et des métiers d'art, et à l'impact donc sur des pratiques qui seraient plutôt réflexives et transformatrices. D'où la qualification, j'espère que vous serez d'accord avec ça, d'avoir des questionnements plutôt en open science et qui explorent notamment la relation entre design et le quotidien. C'est un volet qui, je suppose, a été regardé beaucoup lors des 20 heures précédentes. César, à ma gauche, César Jungaradi, est un designer franco-japonais, environnementaliste, éducateur, entrepreneur, qui est basé à Singapour. Il est actuellement professeur associé en design au Singapore Institute of Technology. Il fait sa thèse au CNAM, si j'ai bien compris, sous la direction de Pierre, et travaille en open science pour l'ensemble de ses projets de design et d'innovation. Enfin, last but not least, Rigas Arvanitis, directeur de recherche à l'IRD, sociologue, membre et ancien directeur du CEPED. Il a une expérience de terrain dans de nombreux pays, Amérique latine, Chine, pays arabes, membre fondateur de l'IFRIS, dont il a été le directeur. Il a travaillé également au Liban. Il a dirigé un projet de recherche sur la production de connaissances dans le monde arabe avec le sociologue Sari Hanafi. Je passe sur toutes les autres choses nombreuses qu'il a faites. Et puis, moi, je suis ingénieure de recherche au CNRS, sociologue au LISIS et autrice d'une étude sur les marchés globaux de la publication scientifique en chimie. Et là, j'interroge dans une dimension critique les modalités pratiques de l'open access en sciences. Voilà. Pour ce qui est des questions, et là, je voudrais ouvrir le débat et donner la parole aux uns et aux autres, en particulier à Matias. On a un ensemble de questions autour de qu'est-ce qui a changé avec la mondialisation depuis 25 ans, qu'est-ce que vos enquêtes, c'est surtout ça, ou vos expériences diverses donnent à voir sur le déploiement de la science ouverte depuis 25 ans. Et enfin, comment peut-on croiser d'autres méthodes pour compléter notre connaissance sur les processus, les enchevêtrements d'infrastructures, les continuités, les ruptures d'un mouvement vers ce qu'on appelait l'ouverture de la science. Je donne la parole à Matias en lui laissant le choix de la langue qu'il souhaite utiliser.
Thank you, Marianne. I will speak in English.
Matias, on ne peut pas entendre.
You
need to activate your microphone, perhaps?
We don't hear you.
Okay. Why is...
Can I hear you?
El pinche micrófono está cerrado.
Vous pouvez parler, peut-être? Non?
Hola, hola. Hi.
Non.
Hear me?
Pas.
No?
I can listen perfectly here.
Peut-être on peut faire parler l'autre personne en attendant que ça se mette.
Peut-être Fernanda?
Ouais.
Could you hear us, Fernanda?
We
I can listen to Matias.
No, the same. We don't hear you. There's a technical problem.
It's on their side.
Okay, great.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Yes, please,
Yes,
Matias.
Matias.
Perfect.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
No, thank you. I can do either English or Spanish. I think my Spanish is Argentinian, so I rather stick to English. It's going to be more understandable. So let's stick to the lingua franca, but then we can course either in English or in Spanish from Argentina or from Mexico. That we can do when the microphone stops working again. Okay. I have like a couple of notes on things I probably want to stress about this, but I'm more here to hear the rest of the very interesting people that is also meeting here today. But I wanted to give like a sense of where I'm standing and the kind of things that I was thinking through when trying to answer the three questions that we had as calling for today. And there are like 4 streams of work that I think really connect to this question about globalization and open science in my case. And the first one is like, the study I've been doing along with colleagues in publication trends, in scholarly publication trends in different languages, in different countries, and trying to understand how similar objects are framed in different spaces. And we've done some work in around globalization in French and Spanish and English. Also, the study that I'm currently doing and participating with colleagues in trying to understand the practices of sharing and anti-sharing within the context of open science, specifically in the disciplinary space, you say, of socio-environmental research, which is multidisciplinary, but also enrolls stakeholders that go beyond academia. Then a third stream is kind of relates to the study of open knowledge infrastructures, specifically trying to understand the development of software that supports open access. And finally, last but not least, the understanding of the practices of researchers when adopting APCs outside the global north. And to answer this idea of this question of what has happened, what has changed with globalization over the past 25 years, which is like a long period of time, of course. But one thing that I think it's useful to start to answer this question is like the first idea that people had of globalization as a monolithic, perhaps a one-way diffusion process where regulation, goods, and capital started to flow down south mostly. Then we can see, or we have seen, that this understanding of globalization can be can fall short, and globalization is actually composed by dynamic elements that can be fragmented, but still, by being fragmented, doesn't mean that are disconnected and they're not dynamic. And we can see this when we see different ways of studying objects that are present in different literature streams, like global cities, like social movements, like even the environment of higher education. When you see like how different literatures deal with this, we see different scales, we see different paces, like different speeds of dealing with the different ways and different stages of dealing with these objects. And we see a diversity, but still we see these fragmentations kind of connecting at different levels, which is interesting to see because we're seeing a globalization as a fragmenting process that is not perfectly synchronic. And this diversity opens to a wide range of possibilities. So this rising complexity is connected to this way of fragmenting agendas, even on a similar issue or issues that resemble to each other. This complexity is perhaps a good way of thinking about this heterogeneity and the collectives that support this heterogeneous kind of way of thinking or dealing with research objects. And I think it's a good place to start thinking about open science, right? Open science, it's a very broad space, but also it's a place where like a lot of heterogeneous collectives get together under this umbrella, you could say this conceptual umbrella, to organize the work and to be together, but in a modular nature, because everyone is kind of working on their space and trying to share and adapt and connect the things they're doing. And in that sense, we can make a parallel between what is happening in open science and what's happening in globalization, and trying to think how globalization is also being increasingly infrastructured, right? How are specific infrastructure being developed and deployed to support this globalization? But when we think about these infrastructures, we also need to keep in mind that standardization is being a critical component for this globalization to work. So a lot of things that are going on open science deal with this challenge of how to standardize processes that are scattered all over the world, but there need to be similar in some sense to be able to work together. And keep in mind, this idea of fragmentation that I was talking about. But also it's interesting to keep in mind this idea of layers, that standards do not apply at the same time for everything. So we have specific spaces, we have specific infrastructure layers that deal with things in different ways because there are technicalities that require it to be so. But also, and I think it's more interesting to think through open science and globalization. These infrastructures that work because they are standardizing machines, right? But they're also standardizing peoples and institutions, right? So we have this tension going on between fragmentation, between places, like different ways of dealing with things, but also increasingly connected and complexity going on through open science and in the space of globalization. And of course,
just to finish, please. Sorry, I'm keeping the time. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I had my phone, but it didn't.
C'est bon.
So yeah, to wrap up, I think we can see this going on perhaps in open access. It's very interesting to see the adoption of commercial open access, how has different practices and dissemination that is going on in the majority world in Latin America. We can, I think we should stress how open science in this idea of fragmentation is supporting the building of specific communities that are critical to be able to stand away from economic imperatives like productivity, efficiency, speed, all that we know about. And I think there is a socio-technical point to make that we cannot think of moving towards openness without keeping in mind the kind of user base that we are dealing with. So technology does support communities, but communities do support technologies. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, yes, thank you so much, Matias. Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I now give the floor to Fernanda to present maybe an overview also to the du paysage et des pratiques, pardon, en français, que tu as utilisé aussi dans tes études sur l'open source. Fernanda, à toi.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody. I would start just to continue on Matias' point, but to go on the concept of globalization and or mondialization, or the concept of open science. I would like to make this point. I think that globalization is a concept that was also like a native concept used by everybody in the 90s, and it started like a very naive project. And this naive project was the idea that all the national borders could disappear in terms of economy, in terms of politics, in every sense. And I think that the difference is that open science is really old already, because the movement has like at least 30 years of experiences in terms of open access and different features of open dimensions. But I think that the difference is that the concept of open science that we built in the advisory committee of the UNESCO, but that was already at work in different parts of this movement, is like it was never in the last 5 or 6 years naive. It was never thought as a practice that could be thought without the national policies, or without the national borders, or without the asymmetries. And so in the 8 minutes or less than 9 minutes that I have, I would like to share with you just something that can help us maybe this conceptualization. When the open science the recommendation was approved in 2021, you can see that already these shared principles included openness and inclusiveness, because it was understood that the scientific world was mainly unequal and asymmetrical. So I think that this is one of the differences. I mean, open science in the current and modern way of conceptualizing is very far from being naive. This doesn't mean that we don't have 2 or 3 different projects of open science, the more inclusive and the more exclusive. But I think that we can mention, of course, indigenous knowledge is one of the main conflict points here, and regarding also globalization, national and regional policies, and regarding the protection, especially the protection of subaltern groups. Open evaluation is also a big discussion. And also I would just mention the infrastructural divide or asymmetries that are like the most obvious differences that we have in between the countries and between the South and the North. And finally, I would just pose this issue about interculturality, because it was one of the main things that the recommendation of the UNESCO discussed. And it has to do with the fact that if we talk about open science in a global scale, well, we have to decide if we're talking about an intercultural open science or an open science that only speaks English. And interoperability in the platforms is mainly made in English. And so what I'm going to show now, this is very boring because this is a table that I built, but the idea was just to build a map about the different shares of the languages in the scientific articles that are published in the different platforms that exist and indexes services in the world. So I'm just going to show you that this is built empirically on each one of the platforms, the complete collections. And what I did here is to try to show what we find when we go one language after the other one. Are you seeing English now? I only see you, Matias, so if you can tell me if you're seeing this, thank you. So if you go to all these platforms, you're going to see, I couldn't build this globes in the real dimension because English would occupy the whole world. But what we can see is that Web of Science, of course, is almost all English. Scopus has a very high participation of English papers. OpenAlex is a new platform in the last at least 4 or 5 years that is presenting a different situation in terms of languages, and that's why I brought OpenAlex, because we know that OpenAlex has still many problems in concerning the quality of the data, but in terms of the linguistic data, the literature is showing that it is a good source. And we have a very important look at the green part. The green globe is, the green round thing is OpenAlex. But I would like to show that, of course, La Referencia, Beigel, Avec, Latindex, the other Latin American platforms don't have a very important presence in English, of articles in English, but Cielo does have, because it has been in favor of a shift to English. In terms of French, we also can see that OpenAlex represents a very interesting share. In terms of Spanish, always, because we have a very dynamical regional circuit, publishing circuit, what we can see is that Redalic, and especially La Referencia, is for Portuguese, but we will see that later. But Cielo, Redalic, Beigel, Latindex are very important for the Spanish speaks written type of articles. And the interesting point that I would like to make here is that Latindex has like 1,600 journals that are not indexed in the other platforms, and not either in Scopus, of course, or Web of Science, and not in OpenAlex. And so I think that Latindex represents a very important collection in terms of Spanish-speaking researchers, and that we need to face this in terms of open infrastructures to have this output available and circulating in the open science project that we believe in. And in Portuguese, I would like to just stress La Referencia, because La Referencia is really the major federation of repositories that is not a publishing platform, but you have a doctoral thesis, you have a master thesis, you have dissertations. It's really a very important platform to have access to the Portuguese-speaking type of research. And finally, in the other languages, I would like to show the importance of OpenAlex, because the 20% that you see in OpenAlex, other than English or Spanish or Portuguese, is the other languages in the world. And so I think it's really very interesting to work on OpenAlex. And just to end, if I'm okay, Marianne, I think I have like 2.5 minutes. I would like to say that the only way to advance in an inclusive open science project is to think that interoperability cannot be an English-speaking unique lingua franca type of interoperability. We need multilingualism. We also need scientific autonomy. This is clear and very relevant at this moment, where commercial publishing is like co-opting even all the journals in the world. And then we also need, and we know that this is critical in global terms for the advance of open science, a contextualized type of research assessment. This means that all these languages and all these types of science styles and research publishing formats have to be valued in terms of a multi-scholar type of comprehension of science. And so, in the last thing that I want to show here is that this is possible and only possible if we create in a local, regional, national, global scale, different types and plural types of notions of research quality. This is only possible getting apart from the dominating concept of excellence, which has been very harmful, I think, for science. And to just finalize here, I would say that the project that I'm proposing is not globalization of open science, but a global, inclusive open science that can imply a plurality of agendas, a diversity of circuits of production, and of course, of circulation of knowledge. So I thank you very much.
Oui, merci beaucoup Fernanda et Matias pour ces éclairages qui, en fait, soulignent à la fois effectivement la fragmentation, mais également la diversité et les nécessités d'approches plurielles sur l'évaluation aussi des productions de recherche. Et l'open access et l'open science, c'est vraiment, dans vos deux interventions, une excellente loupe pour aller regarder des phénomènes plus larges. Je laisse la parole à Pierre pour peut-être une discussion un peu plus à bâton rompu à propos de...
En anglais ou in English?
Comme tu veux.
So everybody will, I guess, it will be communicatable. And that's exactly going to be my point, actually, that if it's in English. So just to continue, actually, what has been said, I think this idea of diversity, especially diversity of languages, diversity of access, of points of access, is very important, is very interesting. In the way I read, I see open science, especially from a design perspective, is what I was calling what we call the transforming practices. So imagine the researcher produce a certain perspective, let's call it a knowledge, a certain perspective, and it's disseminated around. What is important is that people can access it, and more importantly, can do something with it, right? It's not only because the paper is somewhere, or the knowledge is somewhere, or the infrastructure is somewhere, it needs to be usable. And that's one of the challenges, for example, for every devices that are digital or electronics, that are more and more in our society, is that when it's broken, it's broken. And many people cannot do much with it anymore. And if you want to do something else with it, well, you can't, because it's not implemented in the functionalities of the device you are using. So in this idea of open science, of openness of knowledge and infrastructures and possibility, is very much also what people can do with what is accessible to them through this open science, so this open, we could say, industry. In this regard, and that is all the more important, I believe, because, and that's where the notion of transforming practices come forward, is that I'll be a bit, as you ask, I will be a bit provocative here. I'll provoke a bit. I don't think the transitions that we are looking for, the transformation of societies we are looking for, is happening in science. It's happening of how people use science to do something in their everyday, in their environment, in their infrastructure. So it's not so much the experts, let's say, who propose something, and I think it's fundamental, it's very important, but it's how then societies, citizens, can take over to do something of their environment, of their society, and so on. So it's not only, once again, it's in these two places, these two moments, that something is happening. And this openness then is very important, because if being in an open paradigm is not only providing access to the information, but providing to means to use this information to do something with it, then it's accomplished. And that's the challenge, I believe, of my work in design, is to discuss the link that is between the people who provide information or provide designs, propositions of design, and the people in their everyday that do something with it. So we have been a lot working with surprisingly, I may say, local governance more than national or international governance, local governance, who are very much interested about how to implement within their environments means for citizens of their own province or city to be more contributive to the life of the city, to the organization that is the policy around the city. And so that was really made through this position of saying, it's not only. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. I feel, but it's not only what we propose to the citizens. That is important. It's very much how they can handle it on their own. For two aspects. One, maybe to go in a certain direction that is wished by society, but something I believe personally much more important is to appropriate them and to do something else that was not expected in the first place. I think that's a very important aspect of this idea of openness in open science and open design, is that, so I use every day the example of, I design a knife, people may use it as a screwdriver. Because at the time they don't have a screwdriver, but they need to screw a screw. And then they will transform what we propose, so what scientists propose, what designers propose, what engineers propose, to do something good for their own environment, for their own life. And this is made possible because of the physical aspect of the knife that can be used as a screwdriver. But what about when it's about information? How can we make it flexible enough, shapeable enough, so that we can make use, hopefully in a good way, but we have the freedom to make use of it in a way that is meaningful in the place we want to be. And then we can discuss it, because we see different ways, and we get back to this idea of diversity. We see different ways people can use what is shared, and that hopefully enrich the way people work together. People are together.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I give the floor perhaps to César, who has probably interesting testimonies or practices to develop in your own work and research project also.
Sure. So maybe I want to build upon the first, when Matias was talking about the first question about 25, what happened in the last 25 years, and sort of go back to building on what everybody was saying. I feel, to me, the two things that has happened simultaneously in the last 25 years. One is the internet. So internet is there, and so it's allowing us to share. And so the knowledge has exploded, but the production of goods, the built environment, experiences, and the amount of data has been exponentially, and standardization has been really exploding. So that's the big one force, if you will. But I think the second one and I think where the open science and design at the junction of those two forces is the life, the living world. Simultaneously, the living world has pretty much been destroyed. And you could say easily at the expenses, basically like everything that is biodiversity, organic matter, like all the living world has been basically taken over by the non-living world in one way. So in a philosophical way, I would sort of oppose those two things. So you have the knowledge world exploding, and you have the living world really dying, basically at the similar sort of like almost at the right proportion at the same time. So in my opinion, the question of like open science and design sits in between those two forces. So my opinion is that the world is very operating from a mercantile, looking at monetization, trying to regulate the environment with carbon markets. In France, we used to call this le droit de polluer. We used to call this le pollueur-payeur, the principle of pollueur-payeur. Before we called this carbon market, which is very sexy, but it's basically allowing rich people to pollute more. This is what it is. And so on one hand, we had those logic of the markets are going to take care of everything, which is the logic of, like big closed science. Is whoever can pay the science, who can buy the most expensive machines to have the most advanced science, they can basically have the firepower to compete in this arena. And I think where we are positioned, open science is sort of the other end. We're saying that it's not market that should regulate the living world. It should be principle. And the principle of open science is the economy that we want to use, the rails that we want to build this future world that's going to be sustainable. So in my opinion, like when we're talking about open science, we are implicitly political, and we're saying we are standing on the side of regulating the relationship between the physical world of the built environment, and also that is dead, and the living world of organic and living matter. And we want to allow living matter to work by law and not by market forces. In my opinion, that's the underlying discussion that is really happening.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe some of you would like to react, or Rigas, you can also.
I think the aspect about materiality that you are mentioning, the materiality of and that open design should be materially feasible to modify the uses you want with the user. I think it's a dream. It's not really, it's something you want to tend to, because the materiality is, the reality is the thing you stumble upon and that hurt, okay? The existence of a table is because when you stumble on the table, it hurts. And designers, you have to deal with that concretely by the forms, and so it's very natural, I would say, that you see the openness like that. But then maybe another side to openness, which is not linked to materiality, which is probably what Matias and Fernanda work upon, which is how ideas could be used differently or the same ideas might be used differently in different contexts. And of course it's linked, both things, the material and let's say the ideal way but for the sake of the discussion, I oppose them here. And I think it's not the same people who do this. In the sense that the ones who, and this, it's a very old issue of what science is for. No? It's not the same people that do the research that you would use yourself with your knife to manage your knife, or rather you would use in a different stage of the development of a product, and then you would have a different view of the product than your scientist that you know of, but who does something very different with the things he has in his lab. I'm just mentioning that because part of the discussion about open science for Latin America, for example, very much, because we have discussed that many times, is that when you are in a peripheral position with an hegemonic center, you do not have access to some of this knowledge. Simply, you do not have access. So it's a dream also to think that you will be able to manage open data. We have in the room, for example, Henry Chavez, who has worked on the open data, and how much they were useless because nobody could mobilize the knowledge you need to do the research with the open data.
I think we agree. Is really important is not only that the information is accessible, but once it's accessible, if it is accessible, which is not even already the case, that we can do something with it, which can be research, which can be thinking further, which can be reflecting on cultures and things like that, which are fundamental things. Next to screw. It's two different things. But the idea is, I believe, is nearly there is still something common, is that we access things in the very large sense of it, and I believe information is part of these things in the very large sense of it. Something we can discuss about. Originally, the terms thing is things we can discuss. We can discuss about. I'll be a big word, but to progress. Either it's personally, culturally, in an activity and things like that. And for this reason, I believe, in my view of design at least, design and research are very close in the way that we try to propose things, and in the same way we can publish something and it's not read, it's condemned, it's erased, or the other way around, it's written, and for centuries it's being, or millenniums it's being discussed, and we have it. In design it's a bit the same. We produce something, and will people pay attention to it or not? Will it just disappear very briefly? Does it become icons? And icons are not only icons because they are super sold, as César was mentioning, but because they're becoming cultural references in our society. So there is a bit of the same dynamic, actually. So we are much closer than you think.
So I'm half Japanese, and last month I was in the Fukushima area measuring radioactivity with the SafeCast collective. And so we do citizen science. So we build our own sensor, we measure radioactivity, we build maps. And many times they were more accurate and more detailed than the government provided one, because just there's more people building those information. And then the government ended up having to tolerate it because it's accurate. And eventually what we see when we go on the ground is that the knowledge of environmental radioactivity, that by any means is still something that is very niche. The local farmers now are measuring themselves their own radioactivity, and they believe they own data much more than even SafeCast produces, and even though we have like thousands of sensors. So I don't think there's, and I don't think it's necessarily like helpful to trying to say, that open science is more for the academic and it should be for the scientists, and that exists in this world. What I have seen on the field is that those things that we think are very scientific, like environmental radioactivity, can be taken by farmers in just a matter of years, and they can become more advanced than the scientists in Tokyo University that have access to this lab. So I think the goal that I would have for me is to try to, in French we say vulgariser, which is not the nice word, but is to
popularization, more
to remove the sacredness of those practices as much as possible, and trust people basically more and more. I'm sure you would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
To come back to the obstacles to open science, maybe, and answer the question of Marianne, what has changed in the 25 years? Basically, what has changed is that there's much more evaluation of science that is done with indicators. And the new thing that appeared in, let's say, less than 10 years is this imperative from the research institutes, the public research institutes, to publish in open access. But the big publishers, and Marianne did a thesis on that, the big publishers have monopolized, have completely occupied the space. Maybe not entirely, Marianne can comment and give us the details. And they transformed the product. What you were reading when you were a scientist in your lab was a journal. Today you read an article that you buy piece by piece. Marianne calls that articleization. The fact that you buy articles, in fact, or buy pieces of. When I began 45 years ago my career, there was no, I was a researcher. There was no knowledge producers. Knowledge was embodied in the role, in the social role that you had, either a researcher, professor, whatever, a designer, or whatever. Today you have a market of knowledge, and this market is not necessarily selling the people that have the embodied knowledge, but just the pieces of paper they write, with which we know it's not sufficient to do a research. I remember working with the biotechnology lab in Mexico, and where there was, they were trying to copy a biofilter, and they did everything correct, and it didn't work, because they were copying a patent that had everything, but the substrate was not defined in the patent. And you had to have this piece of information which was just practice. It was not because they didn't want to put it in the patent. It was just because you knew that if you were buying as a substrate, it was cocoa or coffee grains that were melted and served as a substrate to the various bacteria to grow. it didn't work with another type of products because not the same bacteria and so on and so forth. This kind of knowledge is that. Knowledge is this practice with information. It's not just the information. So what I see as an obstacle is that we really have a difficulty in having circulation because there's a sort of marketization of just the articles, just the information part, the things, and not and it's I think it's the real challenge of the years ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to be too long, but two parts. First, this divide between living versus non-living world. Just the journals, they also exist in a printed paper. This publishing industry is an industry with a very long history, and the way scientists look at articles, read articles, can be questioned with very different approaches, and this is something, of course, we need to address. How do scientists read the paper form, but also the digital one? Or it's not only a digital world. I mean, it's and this knowledge has a value, and the transformation from literature to knowledge is also questionable. First. And second, I would like just to finish to question the role of, we mentioned design and design studies, but also history, anthropology, on the way we should question open science. Because at the core of open access, for instance, there's something which is like a tautology, open access. Why open plus access? Fernanda told us it's a very political strategy, in fact. And the trade, not the market, won, and he won. And he's still very strong with academic, with learned societies, with very strong actors who are not companies, but the American Chemical Society, for the one I know more. So how could we discuss with other colleagues to inform our knowledge of the so-called open science? Open question. Yeah, Matias, perhaps, yeah?
Okay, you said take my way. But I think you were talking, and I couldn't help like connecting this point with what Cesar was saying about popularizing science, right? I think when you see like some very robust open infrastructures that have been working for years, and I'm thinking about, for instance, the OGS, the Open Journal System, you see that they have managed to deal with this sacredness of scientific publication and practices in different ways, right? And trusting people and building sort of community where everyone brings what they have to make things work. And I think much of the open science discourse is also dealing with this idea of sacredness, let's call it, and we need to acknowledge for that much of the things that are happening in order to make knowledge open or accessible are also trying to make it in a way that is not really that available for everyone, right?
Other reaction, Fernanda, perhaps, or?
Yeah, I was thinking that really what you're discussing are two different things, because the virtuous circle that we have around citizen science, as Reggie said, is pretty clear, because it's a type of projects or type of interaction between science and social groups that is conceived by openness, and it is by nature the opposite of erudition. But I think that the previous discussion maybe mixed two different things, because one thing is erudition, the academic elite and the secrecy that is there, or the possibility of understanding for very, very few people. But another different thing is good practices and fair principles, because I think I agree more with, I don't remember the name of your last name to the left of the panel, but I think that a different thing is the good practices and the fair principles, because if you share a data set with no README, with no explanation, I mean, nobody's going to be able to use that. So it's not a good practice in terms of open science.
If I can add to that, I think this idea of good practice is a fundamental aspect to reflect upon, to specify. To be honest, for many years I was really against this idea of good practices, because it would be there is good practices, there is bad practices, and somebody decides for it, which for me was not really something that I was very eager to admit in a way, in my rebellious time of being researcher. I came back to it a bit. I think there is advice, and there are indeed, as you said just before, there is an experience. I mean, it's not only the paper, it's not only what is out of the paper, but it's everything that has happened before, so that this paper does, or this research does exist, and it's people who experimented, it's communities, it's tradition, it's culture who participated. So there is a rich thing.
The infrastructure, publication infrastructure by itself exists too. I mean, it's we experience it
yes,
all the time. I mean, when writing and
so there is exactly that. There is this to be communicated, to go along, that make the open science much more effective in its wish of being open and accessible. But still, maybe I'm going to be idealist again. But it's what I tell my PhD students. So I have one here, so I feel a bit very self-conscious now. But I do value the PhD when the PhD candidate has impressed the PhD director on something that was on proposing something unexpected. And I think this is something very fundamental that goes a bit beyond the good practice in a way, which is important in open science, is that people who use open science impress the one who has produced the open science. And then we have reached something. Once again, maybe I'm again idealist, but this for me would be a dear goal, a dear horizon of saying people who make something impressive or original, unexpected, compared to the one who has proposed the science.
And what's about our analytical concepts, if I may say so,
well,
in our
that I have a very design perspective, where design is much more about what emerges. So it's not so much an analytical thing, it's very much about what emerges, not what is what could be more than what is as a research. So maybe I have this bias of saying,
no, this is not a bias, but this is your position.
Again, I mean, you could imagine from my proposition of analyzing a thing, a topic, a subject, an object, a field, then producing something, you say, but when I read that, and I read this other open things, something emerged that I was not in the first place expecting. And then we have progress, both of us.
Yeah, I just think about, and I give the floor.
Time, maybe 2 minutes,
Okay, please.
So I would say that the biggest risk, I would say, is that I think we all agree on this panel about the sort of moral imperative of open science. We know it's the right thing to do. We know that this is, in theory, this is what allows people to collaborate better. So in theory, you should accelerate the pace of science and you should reduce the cost of the application of the science, theoretically. So I think what the real crux of the battle is, okay, how do we turn the science, and this is I think the role of design, into example where we also win on the economical battleground? How do we use this science and then demonstrate, for example, that we can develop technologies or products or services that are actually competitive and better than what is done with the close science? And I think if we can do that, then we can sort of refutate the purely economic argument of close science. If we can do open science that is better than the closed science, that produces a better society, that improves the social realm, so outside of academia, then we make our point and we win. So in a way, my opinion is that open science will, quote unquote, win when we prove it outside of academia on the economic battleground, which we tend to want to be outside of. We want to say like we are pure, we're academic, we're sharing our information, we're not making more money out of it, but somehow we still need to show that the application of our work wins on that battleground as well. Ideally, I would say.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure we have a lot of time to, 2 minutes, that's enough. I will conclude this roundtable by thanking all of you, and I think, okay. Do you have just one word, please, Rigas?
One word is that open science, which is an imperative, has an enemy, which is marketization. And this is exactly the contrary of what design was supposed to be, to promote easier things to be marketized, or at least at a certain point. So we do have a problem.
Yeah, but perhaps the feminist groups, say to us now that also having concepts in France, having concepts helps also people being empowered in battles against sexual violence and patriarchy and so on and so forth. So let's keep the line together. Thank you very much.